Welcome to episode 197 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm talking with Dan Heath, the author of the new book, Upstream, The Quest to Solve Problems Before They Happen. We're going to be discussing how to create much-needed change in our systems and institutions. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the transcript or find our Truth for Teachers podcast community on Facebook. This episode is brought to you in part by ViewSonic. Their company has been dedicated to being part of the educational community for over 30 years. And now they want to help the millions of teachers and students who are finding themselves trying to learn from home. They're currently offering free access to their MyViewBoard digital whiteboarding software, giving teachers all the distance learning tools they need to continue to conduct classes. And now MyViewBoard includes new features released this month designed just for virtual classrooms. Check it out today and get access at myviewboard.com/distance-learning. I also want to talk to you about how to provide distance learning and earn graduate level credits at the same time. Take a look at Teachers Learning Center, aka TLC. Educators from all 50 states go to TLC for their professional development and graduate credit needs. They are accredited nationwide and offer a range of unique courses, including designing an online classroom and other tech-related pedagogy. You control your schedule and there's no travel needed. Go to tlcgraduatecredits.com/Angela. That's tlcgraduatecredits.com/Angela and get your coupon now. So my guest today is Dan Heath. He is a New York Times bestselling author of 5 books, the most recent being Upstream, The Quest to Solve Problems Before They Happen. I received an advanced review copy of the book a few weeks back, and I devoured the entire thing in 3 days. I can't even remember the last time that I've been that enthusiastic about a book. So I'm really excited to have Dan here. If you've listened to my episode about reimagining schools after this emergency distance learning is over, but you wanted more ideas about how to create this systemic change, how to reimagine things and create something better in the fall, I think you will find this episode to be fascinating. Because the truth is, right now we have an opportunity to sort of press a reset button on the way that we were doing life. This is an opportunity for change in many areas, in healthcare, in the economy, change for our planet, and so on. Every part of our lives and society has been touched right now and will be changed. So it's up to us to envision a better new normal. Dan's going to weave in a number of interesting stories here to help with that. Listen in. Dan, I'm so excited to have you on the show talking about your book, Upstream, because it's about changing systems. And that's something that I'm really passionate about. And I think it's a topic that is more pertinent right now than ever. I think that a lot of the inherent flaws in our systems and society are being exposed in new ways right now. And the way that I see it, we have an unprecedented opportunity to explore new ways of solving some of these problems. So I'm wondering if you can start by explaining the upstream analogy and how it can help us approach problem solving more effectively.
Yes. So this upstream terminology comes from a parable that's pretty well known in public health, but not so widely outside it. It's often attributed to a sociologist named Irving Zola. So the parable goes like this. You and a friend are having a picnic on the bank of a river. You've laid out your picnic blanket. You're just about to enjoy your lunch when you hear a shout from the direction of the river. So you both look back, and there's a child in the water thrashing about, apparently drowning. And so you both instinctively dive in, grab the child, you bring them to shore. And just as your adrenaline is starting to subside a bit, you hear another shout. You look back, it's a second child. So back in the water you go, you fish that child out. No sooner have you brought them to shore than you hear 2 more cries. Now there are 2 kids in the water. And so it goes, a kind of revolving door of rescue where you're in and out of the water and saving child after child. And it's getting exhausting. And right about that time, your friend starts swimming to shore and steps out as though to leave you alone. And you say, "Hey, where are you going? I need help. I can't save all these kids by myself." And your friend says, "I'm going upstream to tackle the guy who's throwing all these kids in the river."
Hmm.
And that, in a nutshell, is what this book is about. This tendency that we have in our lives and in our work to get trapped in a cycle of reaction where we're constantly putting out fires and responding to emergencies, but we never get around to solving the problems that beget the emergencies. We never get around to tinkering with the systems that are causing those problems. And I'll give you an example from healthcare. The healthcare system that we've learned to accept is one that is, 98% downstream. I talked to a guy who was a former senior administrator in Medicare and Medicaid, and he said, we'll pay $40,000 a year for the price of insulin, but we won't pay $1,000 to prevent someone from ever getting diabetes.
Mm.
And that's the way our world works, is we have such a profound bias for reacting to problems once they materialize, and we don't have a corresponding priority on preventing those things.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the issues in our school systems. One of the things that you talk a lot about in the book is the problem of tunneling, and I think that that's a big part of why it's difficult to create change in schools. We're always working around problems in the moment because of the number of problems and the urgency of them. So we never really have a chance to move into systems thinking. Can you talk to us about what tunneling is and how we avoid it so we're not just propping up broken systems?
Yes, and I think this is one of the most important parts of the story. So let me start with a study from a woman named Anita Tucker, who, for her dissertation at Harvard, she studied nurses and she shadowed them for hundreds of hours, just following them around, trying to get a sense of what their days were like. And what she described was a life that was filled with kind of novel problem solving challenges. And sometimes they were relatively trivial. A nurse figures out she needs a towel for her patient, but her unit is out of towels. So she runs over to the next unit over and nabs some of their towels and brings them back. Sometimes there are more serious things, like she describes this one day when a nurse with the pseudonym Abby was trying to check out a mother who just had a baby from the hospital. She was ready to go home. And part of the checkout procedure is to take off the security anklet from the baby's ankle. And on this day, the anklet was missing. So they run around the unit trying to find this anklet. It turns out it's in the baby's bassinet. So check, they can get this mother safely discharged. And then, weirdly, about 3 hours later, that same nurse had the same problem happen again with a different baby. The anklet was missing. And so they did another frantic search, and this time they couldn't find it. And so they had to figure out a different way to honor all the relevant security protocols, but still get this woman discharged with her new baby. And she did. And so that's what a nurse's life is like. You're constantly dealing with problems that pop up. And the nurses had this ability to work around these problems seamlessly. They would just improvise a solution. They would figure out a way around. They didn't need more resources. They didn't need to go to running to their boss every time something happened. And so this portrait of nurses is an inspiring one, right? They're resourceful, they're scrappy, they're persistent. And yet, if I reframe this story from a different direction, what we can realize to our horror is that this is a system that is never improving. It's a system that's never learning, because when these nurses work around problems again and again and again, what that necessarily means is that they're never solving any of them. They're never addressing any of the systems that beget those problems. So the nurse that went to the other unit and nabbed some towels, I mean, what she's done is just set up that unit to run out of towels a few hours later. And this was something that shocked Anita Tucker, the woman who's doing their research, is she basically never observed a nurse doing systems level problem solving. Now, I want to be clear here. This is not to run down nurses, for goodness sakes. I mean, I think Anita Tucker could have studied any profession in the world and found exactly the same thing. This is not a nurse's thing. This is a humanity thing. And I
Hmm.
suspect a lot of teachers listening to this are nodding their heads saying, yeah, that's my life exactly. And
Hmm.
this phenomenon is something I want to call tunneling, which is a word I'm borrowing from a wonderful psychology book called Scarcity. And what the authors mean by that term tunneling is they say anytime we're dealing with a scarcity in life, a scarcity of money, a scarcity of time, what happens is we kind of give up trying to systematically solve all the things in front of us. And life becomes this kind of juggling act, or to use the tunnel metaphor, picture yourself in a tunnel. Assuming you don't want to go backwards, there's only one direction available, You got to just get on your hands and knees and scurry forward. And if a problem pops up, your incentive is just get it behind you so you can move on. That's what these nurses were doing. They were tunneling, they run out of towels, they want to get past it. And why are they doing that? Because they have a scarcity of time to address all of the things that their patients need from them. I mean, think about how unnatural it would have been for them to say, oh, well, we're missing this anklet. Let's do some root cause analysis here. Let's contact the manufacturer to see if there's any tightening protocols we haven't access. I mean, it's absurd, right? And yet, even as we empathize with the situation they're in, we have to realize something, that tunneling is a trap. That as long as we stay in the tunnel, we're basically dooming ourselves to repeating those same workarounds, fishing those same kids out of the river again and again and again. And so that, in a way, is maybe the foremost challenge to upstream thinking, is that organizations push us in the tunnel. Life pushes us in the tunnel. But if we're ever going to solve problems, we have to escape it. And that's a challenge. The solutions to tunneling are not easy as a whole. It's not easy to imagine a world where none of us are tunneling, but the good news is that even brief escapes from the tunnel can be really powerful. Like, I'll give you a healthcare example. In a lot of health systems, they're using what they call a safety huddle, which is a meeting that happens every morning, where people stand in a circle, and it's doctors and it's nurses, and they talk about safety near misses from the day before. Were there patients who almost got the wrong medication or the wrong dose, or were there procedures that almost went wrong? What can we learn from those things, and how can we fix the systems going forward? And a meeting like that, it might last 15 minutes, 20 minutes, would have been the perfect place for that nurse to say, hey, we ran into the same problem twice yesterday, this weird thing with the anklets, and I know we're putting them on tight enough, so I'm not sure what's going on here. That would have been the perfect opportunity to figure out, okay, how do we at least get in motion a systemic fix to this problem? And notice that's just 20 minutes outside the tunnel. I mean, as soon as that meeting is over, chances are all those doctors and nurses are right back in the tunnel. But even so, it gives you, the hope, the kind of light to see that we could solve some of these things systemically.
Let's see if we can apply it a little bit to what's happening in schools. If teachers are noticing a structural problem, a practice that isn't what's best for kids or that isn't working well, and they're finding themselves tunneling, but they know they need to be able to take that step back and think about systemic change. What are some principles they can use to help guide them as they're working toward that?
Yeah, great question. So let me take this in two parts if I can. So first, I want to tell a story, and it's a little bit of a long story, but I think it's critical. I think it's one of the most important stories that I came across, and it happens to be from education. So I think it's right on point. And then once I've told that story, I think we can kind of point back at it and see what are the principles we can extract for the things we're worried about. So the story I'm talking about happens at Chicago Public Schools, CPS, one of the largest school districts in the country, 300,000 plus students, a $6 billion budget, which is about the same as the whole city of Seattle. This is a big battleship we're talking about. And back in 1998 era, the graduation rate at CPS was 52%. I mean,
Mhm.
you had a coin flip's chance of graduating as a teenager in CPS. And so imagine, to your question, imagine you're a concerned teacher or administrator inside that system, and you just find it unbearable, intolerable that the failure rate is that high. What do you do? Well, let me describe what happened at CPS. The first ray of hope that things could be different came when some academics, including a woman named Elaine Allensworth, who's become really well known for this work, she discovered that in the freshman year, they could predict with 80% accuracy which of those freshmen would go on to graduate and which would drop out. I mean, freshman year, 4 years ahead, 80% accuracy. They called this metric freshman on track. And there were two very simple components of it. One was, did the freshman complete 5 full year course credits? And did they not fail more than one core course? So if you failed a core course like English or math, and if you failed just one, you could still be on track. 2 was the critical threshold. And those two things together compiled this freshman on track metric that was very predictive. So in a nutshell, what they found was there's something peculiar about the ninth grade year, this kind of transition point into high school, that is critical for getting students to graduate. All right, so that's part one of the story. Part two is, what do you do with that information? So a freshman is off track. What now? And that's where they had to invent new ways of collaborating together. So the first thing that they observed was some of their own policies were sabotaging their students unwittingly. So one example was the early or the late 90s and the early aughts were the tough on discipline era, zero tolerance. And I talked to one person who was active in this work, and she said, in those days, 2 week suspensions were doled out like candy. A couple of kids would shove each other in the hallway, and boom, both of them were out with the 2 week suspension. Well, what we now know from the research is if you take an at-risk kid and you kick him out of school for 2 weeks, guess what happens? They never catch up. They come
Right.
back, they're lost, they fail the class, they fail a couple of classes, and boom, they're off track. So, do you think any of those assistant principals knew when they were doling out these suspensions that they might well be dooming them to drop out of high school? Certainly not. But you've got to look at systems carefully when you're going to change them. The most profound thing that they did by way of changing students' trajectories from off track to on track, they adopted this practice called freshman success teams, where all the ninth grade faculty, biology, English, math, arts, and so forth, they would get together, a couple times a month, and the subject was specific students. They would get a list from the district of students who were most likely to be off track based on their current grades, based on their attendance. And they would go name by name. They would say, okay, Michael, was he in school every day last week? Okay. How are his math grades doing? Last time they were suffering. Well, we got him some extra tutoring, so now he's at a C. Okay, great. Let's talk about Keisha. Well, Keisha's having this issue where she has to drop off her little sister at elementary school every morning, so she ends up coming to first period late almost every day. Oh gosh, we're not going to be able to fix that. So what if we switch her into PE first period? So at least if she suffers in first period, it's for a class that's an elective rather than a core course. And that was the way change was made. It was made one name at a time. And school by school, meeting by meeting, student by student, these numbers started to budge. They started getting students to show up at school more. They started figuring out ways to boost grades, to give more support. And the freshman on track numbers began to improve. And then, just as those numbers had predicted, 4 years later, when it was time for those kids to graduate, they started graduating in higher and higher numbers to the point where last year or the year prior, the number was up to 78% graduation. I mean,
Wow.
more than a 25-point increase in the graduation rate in one of the biggest school districts in the country. And I think anybody listening to this who's been involved in education can appreciate just the sheer magnitude and improbability of that story. I mean, this is one of those situations where most people just assume a posture of learned helplessness. It's too big of a problem. The district is too big. There's no way we can ever pull enough levers to move this. They moved it. And so, to circle back to your question now, I want to point out a couple of things that we can learn from this story that I think we can apply to almost anything that we want to solve at the upstream level. The first is, to solve upstream challenges is often going to require a level of integration from us that we're not used to. Organizations push us to specialize. We're pushed into our silos. We're a biology ninth grade teacher, and you don't have any idea what's going on in the math classroom or the English classroom, and there was never any natural reason for you to be collaborating with those teachers. But to help keep students on track, they realized we've all only got one piece of the puzzle here. We have this student for an hour a day. That's all we see. But if we put together all of our hours, all of a sudden we start to get a more holistic picture and we can help. So part of the upstream story is we have to reach our arms out and connect with people who have other facets of the problem, whether that be other teachers, whether it be administrators, whether it be parents, whether it be the business community, whatever it is. Upstream work often requires integration. The second thing is, it helps to solve upstream challenges when we can get early warning of the problem. So that luxury of knowing at the ninth grade year who was off track, That was so powerful. You know, a student as a senior shows up in the counselor's office and says, "I'm dropping out." Boy, that's the student drowning in the river, right? There's very little you can do at that point. But as a freshman, you extend your runway, you extend the possibilities um, and potential for altering that trajectory. And then the third thing that I think in some ways may be the most important, and boy, I know this is going to resonate. I know it does with my teacher friends. We have to learn to use data for learning, not for inspection. And,
Hmm.
and that's a some terminology I learned from a friend of mine, Joe McCannon, who's a healthcare expert. And what I mean is, we're used to in our worlds. I'm more familiar with the business world, and it's certainly the same in this respect as education. We're used to data being used to inspect us, to judge us. We're not hitting our standardized test numbers, or in the business world, it's we didn't hit our sales numbers last quarter, and data is being used to judge our performance, and it's almost like that's so familiar we can't conceptualize another way to use data. But notice in the Chicago Public Schools story, what they were doing was they were using data to navigate. They were getting information on, okay, Michael, what was his attendance last week? What were his grades in math? What were his grades in English? What else do we know from Michael's situation, from the counselor? What's going on at home? And all of that was used to figure out, what can we do to help Michael next week? And and that's a very, very powerful thing. As my friend Joe McCannon says, people don't need someone standing over their shoulder watching their performance for the sake of praising or chastising them. What they need is a goal that they care about, access to data that helps them assess whether they're getting closer or further away from that goal, and they need to be left alone. And I think that's a really powerful thing that a lot of districts need to learn from CPS, is the power of data when it's used for learning. So I know that was a long spiel. I'll come up for air here.
No, that's really good because a lot of schools, they are using data for inspection. They're having these weekly meetings, these PLCs or these data analysis meetings, where they're supposed to be meeting and talking about these kinds of things, but it ends up being a thing where it's almost like we're not using the data in the right way, and I think we're not integrating, as you were saying. I think right now with the pandemic, the whole way that we do school has been disrupted. So the tunnel that we've been, sort of buried in, it has disappeared overnight. And I think that's exposing a lot of different flaws in the way that we do school. So the inequities that were there the whole time are sort of being magnified in new ways. And I see this as an important opportunity for us to go upstream, to do some systems thinking and reimagine the way that we teach and the way that we do school to sort of address those inequities. So I know that you don't bill yourself as an educational expert, but I know that you are an expert in solving big problems and um, systems thinking. And I know you've learned lots of lessons from lots of different industries. And so I'm wondering if you see any upstream opportunities for teachers or for educational systems, just with the way things have been disrupted recently.
Well, I actually want to just hold up a mirror back to you, because I listened to one of your recent podcasts. Maybe you can share with the listeners what number or what title it was, because I don't recall. But what I do recall is you made this brilliant case that this pandemic, which is something that nobody ever asked for, nobody would have wished for, and it's terrible in so many ways, has this silver lining, which is that it's in essence a once in a lifetime opportunity for experimentation. And you were challenging teachers. Hey, we've always dreamed of a world where we weren't, you know, constrained by teaching to the test and these kind of arbitrary measurements imposed on us from outside. And for this unfortunate reason, we have been given a license to try new things. Like, this is our time. This is our time to try something new. This is our time to try that stuff that we've always wanted to try. And I thought that was so powerful. It hadn't dawned on me at all. And I think the reason is, it would be very easy to slip from one tunnel to another. We went to the tunnel from our
Mhm.
routines and school districts to the tunnel of, oh my gosh, how do we get all this online technology working? And it's such a drag. And how do I monitor my students? And I mean, we can just take off one tunnel and dawn another one. But what if we reframe that and said, this is our chance to try all those things we've wanted to try? And so from an upstream perspective, I think the challenge that I would give everyone listening right now is, number one, honor Angela's call to action, and you should listen to her whole case because it's very, very powerful. And then the second thing is, I would direct your attention to this question: how will you know you're succeeding? Because I think a lot of us are skeptics that the way we're measuring educational success right now are the right ways. But when we all get back to normal, when we all come back into those school buildings and the standardized tests are back in operation, you're going to have something to persuade your colleagues that things should change. And so it's one thing for it to feel good as a relief or as an opportunity to experiment, but just be aware, what's the something that you're going to point to show what you did is something that should become permanent rather than just a brief escape from the tunnel. And so be very thoughtful about that. What is it exactly that in your world you would hold up as the new badge of success? Is it participation? Is it engagement? Is it collaboration? Is it some measure of creativity? You probably have better ideas than I do, but be thoughtful about what those measures of success are and make sure to bake those into whatever experiments you're running, because it will be so much more powerful when you come back in the fall of 2020 and you can say, hey, here's a thought. Yes, we may trade off some marginal preparation for standardized test X by doing this, but notice how my engagement score shot up when I tried things in a different way. You're going to be better armed to convince your colleagues, to convince your administrators that those experiments you're conducting shouldn't be, confined to this awful period of isolation. I'm curious what you would add to that. I mean, I'm building on your ideas here.
Yeah, I like where you're going with that. You're referencing, episode 192, which was called "Schools Are Closed. This is our chance to reimagine them." And I think, a lot of people are landing exactly, where what we're talking about right now, which is this is a great vision. How do we make it a reality? And I like this idea of thinking of this time to do sort of action research. If you as a teacher know that your students don't normally get enough time for this particular thing, or if their socio-emotional well-being isn't generally centered, but you're doing something different right now for that, notice how well that's working, document what you're doing, document the results, and then use that to make a case in the fall, like that, look, this should be a bigger priority. Look at the results that we got, maybe in ways that aren't measured on a standardized test, but we know are really important for kids.
Exactly right. Yeah, I just find that so convincing that the one thing we could emerge from this terrible period with is a set of new ideas that we've begun to test, and that we've become that we have begun to come up with counter proposals to the system in terms of how we judge whether students are growing and how students are learning. I just think that that's a compelling vision.
These counter proposals, I like that term. Is this something that if we're talking about systemic change, is that something where teachers should be working together and making the case collectively to school leaders? Or do you have any thoughts about how best to do that when we talk about changing structures and systems?
Absolutely. I mean, it kind of goes back to that point about CPS, that to solve really thorny problems means we've got to reach our arms out. In the book, I call this surrounding the problem. That in so many cases, as with the dropout rate, there's no one owner of that. And that's something that's peculiar about upstream challenges. Like if you ask, whose job is it to put out a fire in a house that's on fire? Well, it's the fire department's job. It's easy. They're going to come out and put out the flames. If you ask, whose job is it to prevent houses from catching on fire? That's a very complicated question. And
Mhm.
and you've got lots of constituents there. You've got the fire department plays a role, the homeowner plays a role, the whoever writes the building codes plays a role, the construction foreman plays a role, and on and on and on. And one consequence of having real distributed ownership of a problem is that often it can just drop, right? That in organizations we have this expertise at forcing people to specialize, because a lot of times specialization creates really easy owners of different things. Whose job is it to teach mitosis? Well, it's the ninth grade biology teachers, period. But what we miss is some of the more interesting and profound and important problems are ones that span lots of different owners. And so in a situation like this could be the ideal opportunity to reach out across, certainly across all the faculty in your discipline, I would think, but also potentially reaching out across different disciplines, across different departments when you're talking about goals that are bigger than just preparation for one particular content area. And so be mindful of that CPS example, that they got traction on a big problem by first surrounding it with the right players.
Mhm. So that might mean finding other teachers who are interested in doing this kind of work, who share the vision and who are interested in looking at ways to start creating change sort of from a grassroots level.
Hmm. Certainly.
Mhm.
And not to mention the effects that will have on your own motivation. I mean,
Yes.
it's fun to be part of a team that's trying to do something new and unprecedented. I mean, you have each other to draw on. You can share successes. You can comfort each other in failures. So your own motivation is a big important part of this, and to the extent you can de-isolate yourself, I think it makes you more likely to succeed.
Yes. Love it. Before we close out, I want to sort of zoom out a little bit bigger and just talk about, in general, some of the issues that we're facing right now in the U.S. with the pandemic. And I think there can definitely be an argument made that we just didn't have enough upstream solutions in place. It was seen as too costly. And you talk a lot in the book about how we often don't want to pay for prevention. It's hard to measure prevention because if preventative measures were successful, then it looks like we overreacted and it looks like we didn't need to take such drastic steps to begin with. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on the kinds of upstream solutions that we need to be looking at right now to get things back on track.
Oh boy, you're
Where to
getting me
start,
wound
right?
up on the wrong issue here. Yeah. So I mean, you're so right that one of the reasons we're in the spot that we're in is, I remember talking to a public health expert named Julie Pavlin, and she had this great quote: "In public health, if you do your job, they cut your budget because no one is getting sick."
Mm.
And that pretty much says it all, right? That
Mhm.
um, how do you prove when things do not happen? All of these years when we haven't been hit by a pandemic as hard as we're being hit right now by the coronavirus, my guess is it's because of expertise in public health, but we took it for granted, right? No one was made a hero from protecting us all those years. And what Julie Pavlin said that rings so true, unfortunately true, is that events like this always run in a cycle of crisis and neglect.
Mm.
That, something gets inflamed. The Ebola outbreak in the Obama administration, and we had an Ebola freak out for about a month, and all the world's governments were aligned, and we were massive interventions. And then as soon as it's out of the news, it's like poof, it's gone from our collective consciousness at exactly the time when we should be building up those local health systems in places like West Africa to make sure that if and when this ever breaks out again, they're better armed, they're better prepared for it. And what's most frustrating about this coronavirus outbreak to me is there are many problems in the world that are difficult or impossible to foresee, and we just have to deal with them. This was not one of those. This one was entirely foreseeable, and indeed, it was foreseen by
Mhm.
many, many, many people for decades, not only years, decades. That we have foreseen the threat of a serious pandemic. In fact, even the specific strain of virus that we're talking about was largely foreseeable, and there were so many unforced errors here. You know, the global health security team being disbanded in the White House, and the long delays both in China and in the U.S. at acknowledging how bad the problem was, and not moving fast enough to get testing going, and then there are
Mhm.
more subtle things too, that you realize when you really start poking at systems. Like there was a great column in the New York Times by Farhad Manjoo, and he said he was addressing the lack of masks and protective equipment that we've been reading about. And one reason that's happened is because in many businesses, including health systems, they've started to go to what's called just-in-time inventory. So, at Toyota, when they're making a car, they want the windshield wipers to kind of show up just in time to be placed on the vehicle. I mean, not literally, they have some inventory, but the point is that there's not like 10,000 windshield wipers in inventory, because that would be waste. It would be a waste of space. It would be a waste of resources. You want today's vehicles' windshield wipers to be showing up the night prior, that kind of thing. And that's efficient. We prize efficiency. But the effect of that is when you have the same philosophy about masks in the health system, what you say is, I want, next month's supply of masks to show up today and not a day before. But that creates efficiency at the expense of resilience. And so right now, we've kind of created a super efficient system that has completely failed to prepare us for a time when we might need extra supplies. So I could go on and on and on about the missed opportunities and the problems. Here's the silver lining. Your silver lining in schools was this is a chance for experimentation that rarely comes along. I think the silver lining for global health is that this is forced practice for us,
Mm.
because I mean, the terrifying news is, as bad as this is, it could be a lot worse. I mean, this
Mhm.
could be a deadlier virus. It could be a more contagious virus. We've seen viruses in the past that were both. This was not the worst draw that we could have drawn. And when the big one comes, the kinds of skills that we're being forced to develop right now are going to be so important. I remember a conversation I had with a guy named Jeff Freeman, who works at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. And he said, the error in thinking about emergencies is that we just have a plan that's on a shelf somewhere. And when that thing happens, we pull down the plan and just execute it perfectly. He's like, it doesn't work that way. He said, the disciplines and the skills and the systems that you need in an emergency have to be given a day job,
Mm.
which I thought was so profound. And what he means
Mhm.
is, there are things that we know we're going to have to be good at almost regardless what the emergency is. Like a great example is the ability to work remotely. I mean, organizations across the world are being forced to figure out, hey, how do we work together when we all have to be in our homes? You could imagine 100 different emergencies ranging from another virus to terrorism where we're going to have to be good at that. That we have to give those technologies a day job. In schools, we're figuring out, how do you continue to move students along online? That's a day job. Restaurants figuring out, how do we switch from serving customers in our dining room to delivering or offering quick takeout. Those are day jobs that need practice. And so that's the silver lining that I'm trying to cling to, is it would have been so much wiser for us to practice when we didn't have to practice. But there is some value still in being compelled to practice, because we know this will not be the time we face a situation like this again.
Mhm. I wanna go back to the quote that you gave about how if you do your job well, nothing bad happens. Was that what it was?
Yes, where's that quote? In public health, if you do your job, they cut your budget because no one is getting sick.
Yes, and you know what it else that reminded me of is policing, and you do talk about that a little bit in the book as well. It's like, if we focus our dollars there in preventing crime and no crime happens, then they cut the budget. So it's easier to measure the success of our police force according to how many arrests they make. And I don't know that I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that, because I know criminal justice reform is something that you and I both are really passionate about. I know you've done a lot of research into um, what going upstream looks like in terms of policing and that sort of thing. Can you speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think it was best said by a deputy chief of police for a major Canadian city I met about a decade ago, and he was talking about the tension between what's visible and what's important. And he
Mm,
gave me this thought experiment. He said, imagine two police officers, and one of them goes downtown in the morning to this intersection that gets really busy on the morning commute, and there's a lot of wrecks there. People get hurt, And she just kind of installs herself visibly in that intersection, and her presence makes drivers more careful, more cautious. And because she was there, accidents don't happen. And then contrast her with a different officer that goes to a different part of downtown where there's a prohibited right turn signal. And so she hides around the corner. And when drivers make that illegal right turn, she nabs them, gives them a ticket. And he said, which of these officers is doing more to protect the public safety? And he said, indisputably, it's the first one. She's preventing people from being hurt, from being killed. But he said, if you really ask which of these officers will get praised, which will get promoted, it's going to be the second one, because she has, this stack of tickets that she brings back that provides visible evidence of her success. And meanwhile, that first officer, how does she prove she did anything? Right?
Hmm.
How do you prove that something did not happen? And I think that's so resonant when it comes to the education system. How do you prove when a really thoughtful coach was such an effective mentor that student did not have a brush with the law? How do you attribute something to a teacher that a student did not have a brush with insecurity or a lack of confidence or something more extreme like dropping out of school? And and the case may be, we'll never know. And certainly at an individual level, the horrible thing is we'll never know exactly which students were helped and who exactly deserves the credit for helping them. It's like our best answer is data. So back to the police story, if we can measure data really carefully in that one intersection that's really chaotic, maybe we can establish, hey, there was a difference in the number of collisions before we installed a police officer there to after. And and if that difference is compelling enough, then we can attribute it to our own work. But even so, it's ultimately just numbers moving on a page somewhere. It lacks the drama, it lacks the concreteness of the downstream action. When you fish a drowning kid out of the river, there's kind of an instant jolt of heroism that you get. You're the hero, that was the victim. When you make drowning marginally less probable, as the YMCA has done, by the way, with a lot of things like moving lifeguard chairs closer to the pool or improving scanning techniques that lifeguards use to oversee the pool and banning cell phone use, putting people on rotations, all these kind of boring process level things that have been proven to reduce the number of drowning deaths. Those people are heroes, but they're never treated like heroes, right? Because there
Hmm.
was no moment of heroics. And in fact, what makes them heroes to me is that they prevented the need for heroics. And so part of my agenda in writing this book, honestly, is to try to cultivate a different sense of heroism. That can we get out of the business of defining heroes as the people who rush in to save the day, and might we have a new breed of heroes that are the people who keep the day from needing to be saved?
Oh, that's so powerful. I love that. That's my vision too. I love that you've articulated this so well for teachers.
Yeah, I hope everybody listening to this becomes one of those invisible heroes.
What's something that you wish every teacher understood about systems thinking and creating change?
Well, I tell you, I have some guilt and qualms that I mean, so many of the things we've been talking about in this episode are big. I mean, they're systemic, and the CPS story took 15 years to unfold, and I don't want this to feel like a burden on your shoulders. That, oh gosh, that it's really hard to do this work, and it can be hard, and it can take a long time. But we shouldn't overlook the fact that there are easier ways to do this upstream thinking too, that have more immediate payoff. I mean, even in our own lives. Like I was talking to a guy named Rich Marisa, and he and his wife. I guess all couples have these little things that they bicker about, but their thing was the hallway light. So Rich went in and out of the house a lot, and he would turn on the hallway light to go outside. Often he was taking the dog out or something, and he'd turn on the light. He'd come back in. He'd forget to turn it off, and that was what bugged his wife. And so that became their little thing that they bickered about. It was an irritant in their relationship. And so one day, Rich realizes, like, hey, I can make this go away. He drives to Home Depot. He gets a $15 piece of equipment called a light switch timer. And he takes off the faceplate, puts on the light switch timer, and now he can just press a button. There's buttons for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. You press the button to get 5 minutes of light. He goes outside, he comes back in, the light turns itself off, and they never have to have that argument again for the rest of their marriage. And I have come across situations like that again and again where people, where couples, where teams have just learned to endure, that they've actually adapted to a problem that they never need to face again.
Mhm.
One of the funniest ones and silliest ones was, this woman told me she had her desk moved at work, and her desk happened to be right near the door to a stairwell. You know, a lot of times those doors are really heavily insulated. This is a big metal door, and it was very squeaky. So when people went in and out, it was just like it bugged everyone. And she just found it intolerable. So the next day, she brought some WD-40 from home. She oiled up the hinges on the door, and it was silent. And she said her colleagues just flipped out. They couldn't believe that she had solved this squeak. And I think, to me, that's like a metaphor for uh, the harm of our own adaptability, that we're so good as people at adapting to situations that we can over adapt, that we can stop questioning, hey, this problem that I'm seeing again and again, what if I didn't adapt to it? What if I fixed it? And so
Yes.
that's a challenge I would give to your listeners, is target some of those irritants in your life, whether it's something with your spouse or something personal or something at work, and stop tolerating it and go upstream.
I hope you'll check out Dan Heath's new book, Upstream, and use it to help you imagine new ways to solve problems. Have a great week. You can do this. And remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it.